Thank you, Stuart. I'm just going to introduce Carson. Thank you for attending this afternoon. As an investigator develops a protocol, they think about the patient or the healthy subject, the type of patient or the type of healthy subject they're looking for to enroll in their study. And they focus on kind of the clinical characteristics of the population that they want to do their trial in. You know, like questions like, should their study population be fairly narrowly defined so that a lot of the covariables are not there and they can reach a definitive answer, or should their study population be more broadly defined so that the conclusion of the study is useful for a more broader population? So a lot of the things they think about are how high can the creatinine be and still be in the study, or what should the transaminase levels be and allow them in the trial. And so the focus of those thoughts are, as you design the trial, is on the science of the study. And while these eligibility criteria are important for the proper study design, they really don't address the much broader ethical concepts of fairness in conducting a trial. And specifically, they don't talk. You typically don't think about the fairness in recruiting a trial, and this is what Carson is going to be talking about in a minute or two here. But I did want to talk a little bit about when I think about this topic. I remember a scene that I was involved in 1991 at an AIDS meeting, where they were discussing the design of the first clinical trial of AZT involving pregnant women who had HIV. And as the prototypical male academic professor of those days, that is an old white guy, started describing the study and what they were going to do, the room, which is in this nice Washington, D.C. hotel, like erupted with people screaming at him about the trial design and how they were being experimented on and what they were going to do during the study and after the study. And this woman, like in the row behind me, said, "We're not test tubes for our baby to be experimented on by you guys." And, it strikes you that these investigators just did not reach the population, did not explain this, did not do a good enough job with the community. And actually, those are the early days that the NIAID actually mandated a community advisory board review every protocol before it got fully developed. And so, as a clinical investigator, we must not only consider the scientific question, but also must consider the fact that we really are experimenting on people, and that we should think about who we recruit, and if the people we want to recruit are people that could be our family members or our loved ones, and would they be in this study? Would they want to be in this study? Would they be excluded from this study? So the science is one thing, and that defines certain eligibility criteria, but the ethics define other criteria by which you accrue people, and this is what Carson will be talking about. So I'll turn it over to Carson. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mike. Now that he has your attention, what I really want to do, you're going to have some tools today from BMI and from our recruitment group. But what I'm going to give you, or what I intend to give you, are some tools for your head and some tools for your heart on how you need to think about this. Recruitment itself is not a discrete activity. And I want to overlay that with the general principles of the Belmont. I won't belabor that point, but more of an operational sequence of ethical considerations that were developed by Ezekiel Emanuel and his collaborators at the National Institutes of Health's Department of Bioethics, that was published in the New England Journal of Medicine back in 2001, and they still hold very true today. So these are the three stools, right? I mean, these are the three legs of the ethical stool of conducting clinical research. respect for persons, beneficence, and justice, distributive justice. Who's in the study, who's out of the study, really becomes more of the operative question. But how does this translate into what I do? I think we think easily, okay, respect for persons, autonomy. We think about that as consent. But what about these other pieces? So what Dr. Emanuel and his group developed were these 7 ethical requirements of human subject research: value, validity, fair subject selection, benefit and risk, independent review, informed consent, respect for enrolled subjects. You can see that informed consent is pretty far down in this chronology. And it's actually a culmination of all these preceding activities that are to take place, that you are to think about, that you are to execute. I've highlighted 5 of these, but I'm actually going to pretty much touch on 6 that I think really hold true when you think about recruitment and what methods you're going to use, who you're going to approach, and the content of those messages, the breadth of content of those messages. So when we think of value, the first place where you think of value is yourself, right? What does this mean to me? And I won't belittle the value of that, because you yourself have to have the buy-in on what you're doing and believe in what you're doing. But I think what really can get missed is, what is the value of what I'm doing to the community? And what are their priorities? And what are they interested in? And how can I leverage their interest and their priorities with what I want to accomplish? And this really is a stage at which you begin to engage the community. It's becoming more and more of a consideration, a evaluated consideration, if you will. I think at the IRB level, and I think also at the NIH level, that they want to see this collaborations where you really are pursuing priorities of the population with whom you intend to benefit. And we actually have in the CCTS a group that will help you get yourself engaged, identify groups, and be able to interact with them and set up potentially these community advisory boards. The next item is fair subject selection. These individuals are not means to an end. These are individuals. These are ends in and of themselves. And there's 2 things particularly you need to think about. What is the population that is necessary to answer the question? And I believe the second question to think about is, who can I not exclude? Who should I not exclude? Only those that should be excluded are those for their, let's say, their safety issues. However, this may touch on the point that Mike made earlier about including pregnant women in trials, when in fact you begin to weigh this risk. Well, what's the risk of them not participating? And really the only criteria for them not to participate, is there a scientific reason for them not to be involved? And then there is a risk, is there a risk that is above and beyond any potential direct benefit to these individuals? So you will have populations that are easy to recruit because of their proximity, your clinical population, and that's fine. But you do not want to exclude those populations that are within that realm of your inclusion and exclusion criteria to answer that scientific question. You don't want to exclude them for logistical reasons, lack of convenience. Your population that you recruit may have some proportional reflection on the ease of their recruitment. But I think you also want to have consideration, of the demographics, inadequate representation not only of the two sexes, but various genders as well as various races, reflective of what is in that larger population. And you also need to be aware of privacy and confidentiality issues. If you are within a covered entity, if you're an employee, and this is the way I understand HIPAA, which may be different than some others understand it, but if you are an employee of the covered entity and it is within your realm of responsibilities to access patient information, certainly by HIPAA you can do that. What then becomes the real question, though, is, okay, I can access this information, but who really should be the person to contact these people? If you don't have any direct contact with them, how would you feel as the individual being contacted by someone that you don't have any idea about, but who by law actually could have that access to the information and contact you? So this is, again, one of those pieces where I believe you need to think beyond what by law you're allowed to do, or potentially even by any policy. Think beyond what is a best practice. And this is really where it comes into play. The first point, the first time I will say, treat others, approach others as you would want to be treated, as you would want to be approached. And I think therein, and if that's all I say to you today, I think that's the take-home nugget. I think it's very elementary. I think it's very profound. And it serves as a great operative. There have been too many instances across the country where legally these individuals could be contacted that has raised some concern, raised some complaints. And so I think you need to think about that. Oftentimes what will happen is that maybe require you in a collaboration with, let's say if you're a PhD researcher and you're in the population that you're after, you need to collaborate with medical personnel and or nurses to bring them on in your study team, or at least approach them for them to make that initial contact with candidate subjects. So then, for them, it's okay. They know who these people are. And if they decide that they know they don't want to go through with it, that's fine. That's their prerogative, and their privacy has been maintained. If they say yes, they'd like to know more, I think you've done your due diligence. You've been very respectful of them. And I think you would appreciate that as well. Oops. Benefit to risk ratio. So this is some ethereal construct, but you need to consider this in the development of your protocol, as well as how you want to present this, and in what context you're able to present this. So these also are components that the IRB will look on for your protocol, as well as your advertisements or any recruitment materials that you have. The Office of Human Research Protection has a very interesting guidance for the electronic posting of research studies, which says that if you stick to basic descriptive information, while the protocol needs to be reviewed by the IRB, the content of that message, of that posting that contains that basic descriptive information does not. The extent of that is the study title, the purpose of the study, eligibility criteria, location of the study, and contact information. So you can see basically what it doesn't include, right? It doesn't include any language about benefits, risks, and/or inducements, but primarily benefits and/or inducements. There's a platform that we host that Blair and Rose will talk about later, where we have leveraged that to provide a nice platform to post studies here at Ohio State. Clarify benefits and any inducements, should they be posted. But in general, with your message, be clear, be concise, and be consistent. And that's not just your recruitment message, but that's the message that you're giving to these people from that initial point of contact, through the consent process, through the time that they're in the study. Recruitment is really that initial contact, is that initial part of the conversation. It's the prelude to the consent process, and it's also the prelude to retention. So I mentioned this, these are those components that they will take into consideration, and I noted this here, that the recruitment materials are reviewed by the IRB and must be approved before implementation. However, there is this particular exception. But the terms of that exception are quite strict. So I really think, so again, when people think of what is the ethical requirement of research, it's usually, well, informed consent. But from what it posted here earlier, that's really the fifth step in your thinking. You haven't necessarily even contacted the candidate subjects, before you even get to this point. Certainly, community advisory boards, any patient population groups in that value stage to get their buy-in and understanding of their perspective. But there's so much more that's built into informed consent than just the document. And again, this is an example, just like your recruitment materials, that it's a culmination of these preceding activities, things that you must think about. They do not sit discreetly in and of themselves, but actually is a continuum in a much larger process. Be aware of that process. Understand that recruitment as informed consent is part of that process. What I want to touch on here, too, and this is kind of that boundary between, or that segue between recruitment and the consent process, is this concept of therapeutic misconception. This comes into play when research teams are recruiting candidate subjects, and these candidate subjects are the patients of the members of the research team who are healthcare personnel. Healthcare and research really kind of sit in two different domains of what their approach is. Clinical care really is to treat the individual, with variations in that treatment specific to that individual. Clinical research is to answer a question. The subject is a component of a group to help answer that question, to follow a particular protocol. A rigid protocol, relatively speaking. And what can happen in this dialogue, in this interplay, is that those roles and those environments are conflated. And I know you many of you who have great experience have encountered this. But it's necessary for, I believe it's necessary, in holding with these ethical requirements, so these individuals realize the context in which they're agreeing to be a part of this research project. It differs from individualized care. The physician is the researcher. The nurse may be the study coordinator. There are different roles here that are played. And in that, what can get confused is what are the responsibilities. There's also some conflict of interest issues. And this particularly is very, very important and most often evident in phase 1 studies, which are designed for safety and not designed for efficacy. But the interpretation can be that their participation will yield a benefit. That may happen. I won't deny that. That may happen. But the study, or those types of studies, are not designed that way. The IRB has the prerogative in situations where they may feel that in this case, in this possibility, and depending upon the level of risk, and this goes particularly for gene transfer studies, but they have the prerogative regardless to involve an independent party to participate in the consent process, to serve as an additional resource for candidate subjects to field their questions, and actually to have questions asked back to them so that they fully understand that, one, what research connotates, and then the specifics of the research with the procedures, the risks, and the benefits. Actually, in 2000, the National Institutes of Health instituted a program called Research Subject Advocates as part of their General Clinical Research Center consortium of 60 centers around I think it was 80 centers around the United States, where they implemented a research subject advocate to serve that particular role, to serve as an independent consent advisor, if you will. So think about that too, as a potential piece in that continuum from recruitment to informed consent and then to retention, which is really this piece of respect for enrolled subjects. And so why I kind of have this process, that you may think that the recruitment sits out here as a discrete piece. But as that initial contact, those themes carry out through that whole process, through those interactions, and that initial contact sets their tone on how they feel about your study. And while you also may have the best recruitment approach, it is that continuing process of consent and that continuing process of monitoring that is really going to make or break their retention and their continued participation in the study. In essence, it's merely a dialogue. Trust is built on transparency. Transparency is built on communication. That's a fundamental. And that communication begins all the way in the front with your recruitment strategy. So here are some questions to ask yourself. Is value realized by the study population? How have I generated that concept of what I believe is value? Fair subject selection, what population is best to address the study question? How can they be identified and contacted? And also, as Mike had touched on earlier, this also is very tricky because you have to weigh the extent of external validity or generalizability and internal validity with the resources that you have. And that also is going to guide the breadth and content of your recruitment message and methods. Have the risks been minimized and the benefits maximized? And informed consent. Again, it's not an event. It's not a document. The document is merely a proxy. Actually, your recruitment materials out there are, I would say, also a proxy for really what the communication that you're going to have with these candidate subjects and eventually those that you enroll. So there is often tension between recruiting participants efficiently and respecting their confidentiality and privacy. I brought up that example within a covered entity, looking at HIPAA and the provisos of HIPAA and what's allowed within the covered entity, and weigh that against really what's a good practice. Again, how would you want to be contacted? How would you want to be treated? How would you want to be approached? One strategy may not be all. You may have to employ various strategies to serve the varied population which you intend to enroll to answer your question. And simply here, would you be attracted to participate in this study? Would you enroll in this study based upon what you intend to present? I think it's very simple. I wanted to read one last sentence from the Oxford Book of Clinical Research Ethics. This was written by Frank Miller at NIH in the Department of Bioethics regarding recruitment, participant selection, fair participant selection. Beginnings matter. Recruitment is the first stage of research participation which can set the moral tone for the relationship between investigators and research participants. The process of recruitment deserves greater ethical attention in both conceptual and empirical research. Some are doing that. You're going to live that. Thank you.
Thank you, Carson.
Should
And
we
we have a
hold-
few minutes for questions.
Okay.
We're videotaping it, so I want to give you a mic so that people watching the video will be able to hear. So any questions? There must be questions. Comments?
That's kind of scary. But thank you for your time. Thank you for your ear. So the next presenters are Rose Hallern and Blair Gonsenhauser, and they are the Recruitment and Retention Core for the Center for Clinical and Translational Science. I will add as a brag point that the work that they have done has been recognized nationally, and in fact, with the use of Research Match, a consistent leader in the use of that tool and the enrollment of individuals in Research Match. They set the bar.